Hello and welcome. My name is Alberto Carrillo. I'm the Chief Technical Officer for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Today, we are very excited to be launching the public consultation for the revision of the Corporate Net Zero Standard. This is an opportunity for businesses and other stakeholders to help refine this initial draft and ensure that the standard continues to be an effective tool for driving net zero transformation in the corporate sector. I'm honored to be joined today by my colleague Emma Watson, who is the Head of Corporate Standards on the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Together, we will be walking you through this presentation. In this video, we will introduce the initial consultation draft of the standard, highlight some of the key proposed changes, and most importantly, outline the different ways in which you can participate in this process. The SBTi Corporate Net Zero Standard was released in 2021, and it has become our flagship standard and a global benchmark for credible climate action. Today, more than 3,000 companies and financial institutions have set or committed to set science-based net zero targets. Since its launch, we have gathered feedback from businesses on how the standard can be improved to better support net zero transformation. Using these insights, as well as insights from other stakeholders and research, we are now revising this standard to help more companies set ambitious science-based targets and to accelerate climate action. The direction of change in the standard is clear. We want the standard to be as effective as possible in driving science-based decarbonization. Some of the revisions in the standard aim to remove barriers and to make the standard more pragmatic and more accessible. At the same time, we recognize the importance of alignment with other frameworks across the wider ecosystem and to avoid duplication where possible. I would like to share some of the key sources and work that have informed this consultation draft during the research and drafting phase of the project. We have drawn insights from multiple sources, including the learnings from thousands of companies that have led the way setting science-based targets. We have also gathered emerging thought leadership and research that continues to push the boundaries of knowledge and best practice in corporate climate action. We have received generous and insightful feedback from our advisory group members, as well as the hundreds of stakeholders who have participated in workshops, consultations, and other engagement processes. The standard has been submitted to a thorough and rigorous review by our independent technical council, who have approved this draft for public consultation. These inputs have been invaluable in shaping the revision and in making sure that the standard incorporates best practice, the latest science, and that it addresses the real-world challenges faced by companies today. The revision of the standard follows our standard operating procedure for developing of standards, which includes multiple opportunities for stakeholder input to refine and improve the standard. Today, we are launching the consultation process. This process is designed to gather feedback from businesses and other stakeholders on whether the proposed changes can effectively accelerate decarbonization in the corporate sector. We are particularly keen to understand if any further revisions could enhance the standard impact and practicality. Based on the input that we received through this process, the input from the expert working groups, and the pilot testing, we are ready to refine and iterate this draft. With that, I will hand over to Emma, who will walk us through the key changes proposed in the revised standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. As Alberto mentioned, my name is Emma Watson, and I'm the Head of Corporate Standards at the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I'm now going to walk you through some of the key changes that you should expect when reviewing the initial draft of version 2 of the Corporate Net Zero Standard. There are 4 key changes to look out for. The first of these is around company categorization. So these are tailored requirements based on company size and geography. The second is the new validation model. So this is an updated end-to-end framework for validating and recognizing progress against targets. The third key change is an enhanced target setting framework. So we've made improvements across all scopes, but we've really focused on evolving the approach to scope 3. And finally, there are changes in relation to beyond value chain mitigation, or BVCM, and addressing residual emissions. So we've proposed a recognition option for BVCM within this version of the standard, and we've also introduced 3 proposals to address residual emissions from now until net zero. So I'm now going to take you through each of these in more detail. So on to categorization. We know that many smaller businesses and companies in developing economies have said they lack the capacity and resources to develop and work towards targets. That's why we're proposing a two-tier classification with simpler requirements for small and medium-sized companies operating in lower income regions. Our aim is to help more businesses in this group to set targets. Category A companies, which are large and medium-sized companies operating in higher income geographies, are required to follow all criteria. Category B companies are offered increased flexibility by making some criteria optional. This categorization intends to drive climate action across all types of companies while acknowledging differences in size, resources, and operating context. You can see on this slide some of the key differences in applicability of criteria for Category A and B companies. The updated validation model within version 2 guides companies through every stage of their journey, starting with initial commitments, assessing progress, renewing targets, and ultimately reaching and maintaining a net zero aligned state. As more companies approach the end of their target timeframe, the focus is shifting from ambition to measurable progress. That's why we're introducing a new validation model, which is an end-to-end framework that incentivizes and recognizes credible climate action. As you can see in this slide, the new validation model in version 2 operates in a recurring cycle, which helps companies to set science-based targets, assess and communicate their progress, and establish targets for the next phase. Through this approach, we aim to reinforce accountability, provide meaningful recognition, and drive continuous improvement in the transition to net zero. The new version of the standard proposes some general updates to enhance the target setting process across all scopes. So first of all, the underlying pathways that inform the emission reduction benchmarks have been updated to align with the latest report from IPCC. Secondly, we've made a slight adjustment to the requirements for near-term targets. Previously, near-term targets were required across all scopes, and companies using the SME route were not able to set Scope 3 targets. In the new version, this is split by categorization of company, and near-term Scope 3 targets are optional for Category B companies. Previously, long-term targets were required across all scopes for all companies conforming to the corporate net zero standard. Now, only Category A companies are required to set long-term targets across scopes 1 and 2. The revised standard does not require long-term targets for Scope 3 to focus action in the near term, but we are consulting on whether these should be included. In previous versions of the standard, Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions targets could be combined into a single target. However, the new standard now requires separate targets for each scope. This change enhances transparency, ensures companies remain accountable for reducing their direct and indirect emissions, and prevent any emissions from being overlooked. We know that for many businesses of all sizes, Scope 3 is the biggest barrier to setting net zero targets. More than half of the companies that we surveyed have told us this. So we've introduced 3 major updates on Scope 3 to try and address this challenge. So first, we've updated the approach to target boundaries for Scope 3. So deciding what Scope 3 emissions to include within a company's science-based targets is no longer based on the minimum 67% blanket threshold, but rather there is a company-specific relevance-based approach to deciding what emissions to include. We've introduced further optionality in target setting methods, and this includes introducing the new alignment target setting method that emphasizes outcome-based measurement rather than just absolute or intensity-based metrics. Finally, we've introduced the concept of indirect mitigation, which provides more flexibility in delivery. This recognises the challenges that companies face in addressing value chain emissions where there is limited traceability or limited ability to influence suppliers and customers. So indirect mitigation has been introduced as an interim measure, and we're going to explore this in much more detail through the public consultation, working with our expert working groups, and pilot testing with companies. Finally, we'd like to touch on the topics of residual emissions and beyond value chain mitigation. In our existing standard, we recommend that companies take responsibility for their ongoing emissions above and beyond the requirements to reduce value chain emissions. Companies can deliver beyond value chain mitigation through a range of instruments, including the purchase and retirement of high-quality carbon credits, as well as direct investments. We published 2 reports on BVCM in early 2024, and I'd encourage you to check them out if you'd like to learn more. As this was only a recommendation in the first version, we have revisited this topic and proposed that formal recognition of companies who are investing in BVCM is an option within the standard. The hope is that through this recognition, we can provide a stronger incentive for additional decarbonisation and mobilise climate finance at scale. When it comes to residual emissions, so the existing version of the standard requires companies to neutralise any residual emissions that remain once the long-term science-based target is met. Our draft version 2 is consulting on 3 different approaches that we will explore with our expert working group on how to address residual emissions between now and net zero. It's important to be clear that the draft standard does not allow offsetting, which we define as using carbon credits to meet emission reduction targets instead of value chain reductions. There is no shortcut for deep in-value chain decarbonisation, and we continue to respect the mitigation hierarchy. So how can you get involved? First, you can learn more about the new draft on our website. We will be producing tailored explanatory materials that outline the changes in more detail and make it as easy and as accessible as possible to understand, engage, and provide feedback. We'd also invite you to provide your formal feedback via the public consultation survey, which will be open until the 1st of June. We will also be holding a Q&A webinar in April, so we'd encourage you to submit your questions for that in advance. And we'll also be holding a pilot testing in the second half of the year, which will involve companies. Finally, we'd ask you to spread the word and ask others to share their feedback too. We know this work is more urgent than ever. To drive meaningful action, we must evolve and tackle net zero barriers head on, developing new approaches, conducting research, and taking on board feedback from companies, civil society, and academic experts. Our aim is that this consultation process will help us refine the approach, simplifying where possible and clarifying where necessary. We welcome all feedback from interested parties. The standard will be ready to be used by companies in 2026. Until then, companies should continue setting targets and making progress using the existing standard. Version 1.2 continues to be a credible, well-established framework for companies worldwide to set science-based targets. Companies that have not yet set targets are encouraged to do so now, as efforts undertaken under the current version will continue to be relevant and provide a strong foundation for future alignment with version 2. The SBTi will work to make the transition from version 1.2 as smooth as possible. We have a limited carbon budget left. Companies must act at pace to accelerate climate action and drive transformation, while also building investor confidence and unlocking long-term growth. We need to work together to develop the next version of the standard, and we look forward to collaborating with all of you. Thank you for joining us today.